today, and we're so excited to have you joining us as we learn a little bit more about what our partners at Jeffco Schools as well as Red Rocks are doing as we prepare for what will be a different year for all of us related to education. As we always do on these breakfasts, a couple housekeeping items as we get started this morning. I want to take a moment to thank all of our sponsors who make this work that the Chamber does possible. You can see that big list up on your screen there, and we're incredibly grateful to everybody that's listed on there that has made a commitment to our organization to help us continue to drive our community forward. We'd also like to take a moment to thank the dignitaries who joined us this morning. We always appreciate that level of community engagement on these breakfasts. I'm going to run through the list, but without fail, I'm sure I missed somebody because it is really difficult on these virtual events to capture everybody. So please, if I missed you, use that chat box and let us know that you joined us because we do want to recognize your attendance at this event. But for a quick run through, thank you Arvada Mayor Mark Williams, Arvada City Council members Nancy Ford and Dot Miller, Jefferson County Commissioners Leslie Dahlkemper and Casey Ty, State Representative Tracy Kraft-Tharp, State Senator Rachel Denzinger, Arvada Fire Board members Jim Whitfield and Bob Loveridge, Arvada Fire Chief Mike Piper, Dr. Michele Haney from Red Rocks Community College, Dr. Jason Glass from Jeffco Public Schools, Brad Rupert from the Jeffco School Board. And again, if I missed you, please don't hesitate to put your name in that chat box. Additionally, I'd like to invite all of our candidates. 'Tis the season for candidates to be joining us. So I'd like to invite all of you to place your names and what you're running for in the chat box as well, so that we know that you were able to join us and get to know you a little bit better. I do want to give a couple of quick reminders. We did leave open the chat box and the Q&A box today, but as is true to form with all of these, we do ask for you to maintain kindness and civility. This is a space for learning and coming together as a community, and we appreciate all of you keeping a positive tone as you utilize those resources for these events. We are leaving time at the end of this to answer a few of your questions. We may not get to all of them, but I will be looking at those throughout, and we'll do our best to answer as many as possible, and then are happy to help provide additional resources following the event based on the questions that you're asking. So with all that, it is now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker of today, Dr. Jason Glass, who is no stranger. He's presented for us many times and does an extraordinary job helping communicate what's going on with our school district, and has been a great partner for us as a chamber as we've rolled out our workforce program and a number of other things. So without further ado, Dr. Glass, I will kick it to you to get us started. I will note that we are going to put bios of our presenters in the chat box today, and I encourage all of you to learn a little bit more about those various presenters. Thank you, Dr. Glass.
Thank you, Cami. Good morning, everybody. It's great to connect, and I want to start by expressing my appreciation to the Arvada Chamber and all the businesses in Arvada. You're tremendous supporters of Jeffco Public Schools and partners with us, especially the Chamber and the career technical education programs and internships, mentoring that you've been able to connect us with. So we are incredibly grateful for that connection and that support. And Cami, thank you for the work that you do. I know that you're passionate about this as well, and it shows in the partnership that we have. I thought I could talk a little bit about just reflecting on these past few months that we've been through, and then look ahead to some of the challenges that the school district's going to face in the short term, in the intermediate term, and then longer term looking ahead. This has been an extraordinary year for everybody. I saw a Facebook video of a bear that had nunchucks swinging them around, and I think that is a great symbol of 2020, and who knows what's coming next, what's going to come next at us, what challenges we may face. But 2020 has been a struggle with COVID and all the things that have come our way. You may recall that we were pushed into remote learning or complete remote learning on March 13th. I'm really proud of the way that Jeffco Public Schools made that transition. We were one of the first districts in the state and one of the first districts in the nation to make that transition over and pick up learning quickly, as we had to transition away from in-person learning during the COVID-19 pandemic. While I think we picked up the ball and ran with it, and really it was our only option to make that transition to remote learning this past spring. we shouldn't whitewash the challenges that presented. We know that we had a lot of families and students and staff members that struggled in that remote environment. We were really fortunate at that point to have had 6 months of relationships built and connections made. So when we had to transition to remote learning, the kids knew each other, the kids knew the teachers, and one of the reasons that we were able to keep a high level of engagement at 95% as a district was because we had those relationships in place. And so that was a strength. Even with that, we know that we saw lesser engagement from our communities that have greater numbers of at-risk or disadvantaged students. We struggled with how we would serve kids with disabilities, especially those that required physical touch or hands-on therapy as part of their supports. And so those were definitely challenges in the remote environment. But we did successfully finish this year or this past school year under a remote environment. And then we immediately went to work on these great challenges we have for this coming year. One of those is, how do we reopen school safely in the era of COVID-19? We've got Deputy Superintendent Kristopher Schuh and Tom McDermott on to go into more detail about that. But I'll just preface that conversation by saying there are incredible pushes and pulls on that discussion. And all of our options have a significant downside. So it's one of those wicked problems where every choice you make leads to another set of problems and challenges you have to design through. So we've got tremendous pressures to reopen schools and create in-person learning that's coming from academic and developmental concerns for our students. We know that that wasn't as robust and strong in a completely remote environment. We also have social, emotional, and mental health concerns. We know that kids became disconnected from each other, disconnected from a supportive peer network and supportive adult network to help them with any social, emotional, or mental challenges they may have. We're concerned about that. And we know that when our schools shut down, it creates an economic disruption and drag on our community that contributes to this, the economic challenges that we're facing as a community and as a state and as a nation right now. So those are all pushes on school needs to be reopened in some form and create an in-person experience. At the same time, this virus is transmitted through the community when people get together, and education, as all of us have experienced, is a communal activity. You come together, kids come together, teachers come together in a common space to have the activity of education take place. So it's an opportunity for the virus to spread. So we have to put in place layers of virus mitigation efforts in order to keep our schools safe. So those two competing pressures are something that we are working through right now. I won't steal any more of Kristopher and Tom's thunder. They're going to talk you through what our present plans are. I will just say to end this brief introduction on that element, that because the virus keeps shifting and changing, and its impact on our community keeps shifting and changing, what we know about this virus, lessons that we learn from other systems that have already opened, or plans that come out around the country that bring good ideas, I will just say that there can be no truly final plan at this point. We have to stay agile and adaptive and keep improving and shifting as the conditions shift around us. The second major challenge that we face for next year is the budget. All of us have experienced some economic disruption. I know that our businesses have experienced economic disruption as a result of COVID-19 as well. That leads to lesser tax revenues, which leads to lesser school funding. So one of the challenges, in addition to this transition to remote learning and trying to plan for next year with increased expenses, really, as we think about reopening school in some form, we have less money to deal or to work with from the School Finance Act from the state. We've been able to offset that some with federal funds. Brad Rupert's going to talk to you some about that and some of the long-range challenges we have. So that's a second major challenge that we have right now. And then the third, with the events of George Floyd's murder from the summer and other racial violence, protests, issues that arose in the wake of that, it really has put pressure on school districts around the country to critically self-examine what are our practices and policies when it comes to equity and anti-racism. What can we do as an important social institution to push back against racist policies and build anti-racism in our communities. Some examples of that I'll talk about a little bit later at the end, some ideas that we have about how we engage in that work going forward. But again, we have a responsibility, because we have a moral responsibility to try and create opportunities for every child. And if we're not actively working to make sure that our Black and brown kids have quality opportunities, then we're failing as an education system. So there's a moral pressure on us to engage in this work and do it with integrity. So I want to turn things over to Tom McDermott, who's our Chief Strategy Officer. He's really been doing the project management around all the complexities of the district's restart plan, and Deputy Superintendent Kristopher Schuh, who also serves as the Chief of Schools for our secondary schools. Kristopher has been the lead on the team that's designed the restart plan as it stands today. They're going to walk you through what we're thinking right now, with the asterisk and caveat that what we're thinking today may not be what happens in August, because things keep shifting around a lot. So we look forward to having a conversation with you around those three areas: COVID-19 and our response to it, the budget, and the work that we have to do around anti-racism and equity. We'll give you a brief on all of those and then look forward to your questions and discussion. Tom, let's turn things over to you.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jason. Cami, if you can just grant me screen sharing, that would be great. Kristopher and I have a couple of slides we'd like to share. There we go. All right, I'm Dr. Tom McDermott. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer. I'm really excited for the opportunity. Thank you. And Kristopher and I will take you through a little bit, as Jason mentioned, of our current thinking, again, underscoring that this can change and will likely change as we continue to evaluate information from public health as well as from our community. So Kristopher, I'll turn it over to you.
So thank you for the lead-in, gentlemen. And this slide illustrates where we are and the different options that we have. As you might know, when you think about the surrounding districts here in the Denver metro area, what's happening nationally, as schools are announcing their reopen, it typically falls into three categories. So just going to talk a little bit about these three categories and illustrate these for you and so you have an understanding of them. So the remote online option is where we were in Colorado back in March. You heard Dr. Glass talk about that, where all the students are in 100% remote environment. They're working remotely from home and they're using the online tools. So the other models you're going to hear about, and this was the model that we put out in our restart model on May 22nd, and that's the hybrid. And the hybrid is, you can see the first bullet there. The foundation of the hybrid model is using masks as a mitigation strategy and 6 feet of social distancing. So what that means in our schools, when you walk into a classroom, you could not have the typical 25 or 30 students in a class. You would have a smaller number of students in class with their teacher, and everyone would have that 6 feet of social distancing perimeter around them. And that is one of those public health mitigating strategies, wearing masks and 6 feet of social distancing. As the summer moved along, public health granted us that ability to move into a full return or 100% capacity. You can see the full bullet there, the first bullet that says masks are required, and then it talks about limited cohort groupings of students. So cohorting is the foundation of a 100% capacity return. So you might be hearing about how different school districts are opening. For example, Boulder has announced a hybrid opening at 50% capacity. And we now have some school districts that are considering a remote online option. We haven't heard about them yet. And then we've got full return. We've got several school districts that are announced the full return. So I want you to know not all the metro school districts have announced their return plans yet. A lot of considerations. Tom and I meet with many school districts. There are 18 different school districts that are together in a cohort, and we do meet and talk. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the full return 100% capacity, because that is what our restart plan announced on July 8th. So in Jeffco, the plan is right now, and I stress right now, as you heard Dr. Glass say, because the landscape continues to change, and as it does, we will adapt accordingly. But as it stands today, we're looking at a full return, 100% capacity. So our students are coming back, and our principals and our leadership teams are developing schedules that would place students in a cohort. And as you're probably familiar with at the elementary level, that is exactly what we have done in the past. That is our practice, where students come together in a cohort or a grouping of students and one teacher, and they typically stay together for the entire day. Maybe they have a specials like art, music, or PE. At the secondary level, many of you know that our students take 6 classes or maybe even 7 classes. There are 4 core classes: math, language, social studies, science, and some elective courses. So our principals are also trying to place students into cohorts. And I can give an example there. A typical freshman would take Algebra 1, English, US Government, and Earth Science. Because so many students, or the large majority of freshmen, take those 4 courses, they could be together into one cohort, and their teachers could move in and out of that classroom where the students are. So that is the example of what a cohort is. So when you hear us talking cohorts, or other school districts talking about cohorts, that's what they mean. They're also going to talk about limiting cohorts, because we also know students have singletons. They have marine biology, where there's just one class of 30 students. They have pottery. They might have IB Chinese, or IB physics, or AP physics. These are classes where maybe there's just one class during the day or 2. So that would be another cohort that a student would be in. So once again, in Jeffco, we have announced the full return 100% capacity, but we continue to work with Jeffco Public Health. We continue to collaborate with school districts around us. We continue to study international models to make decisions around what is best, because we're constantly thinking about, on one side, public health, and on the other side, student education, student engagement. And we're always trying to be right in the middle of those. But sometimes we have to move more towards student engagement, student education, sometimes more towards that public health. But those are the guardrails that we operate within. Tom? So Dr. Glass touched a little bit on this. This is the timeline, really, where we've been in Jeffco. So we were in the remote environment back in March, and you remember on March 12th is when the stay-at-home order was issued by our governor. All the school districts then went into a stay-at-home order, and we all moved into remote. As we moved and finished the end of the school year, we published our model on May 22nd, and that announced the hybrid model, and I talked a little bit about that in the last slide. Hybrid is when students are in person at 50%, and then they're remote 50%. So a teacher would have half of their students in front of them, teaching them, and half their students would be in a remote environment. The next day, that group would flip. The other half would be in person, the other half would be on remote. That was the model on the 22nd. We received feedback from our community, thousands upon thousands of pieces of feedback from our staff internally and our community on that model. We took that feedback all the way through the end of June. That feedback, along with, you can see it says testing here on the bottom. We had testing teams. We had elementary testing teams, middle school testing teams, and high school testing teams made up of principals, teachers, our classified staff, paraprofessionals, secretaries, and central staff, directors at the Ed Center, executive directors, walking through our schools and testing the model. With all of the feedback and the information we got from our testing teams, we came up with our plan, which is the 100% capacity or full return that you saw on July 8th. So now we're into that last phase, monitor and adjust. You heard Dr. Glass talk about that. We continue to take feedback. We continue to talk with our associations, which are JCEA, JESPA, and JCAA, and collaborate with them and talk about what is happening with their members, what are we hearing from their members. We have surveys out at this point in time. We're asking our families to let us know, will you send your child back 100% return, or will you send your child back to school in a remote environment? Because those are the 2 options in our restart plan right now. We're also sent a survey out to our staff internally saying, are you comfortable with coming back to school in the 100% capacity? If you are not, there is a process by which they can apply if they have an underlying health concern or they're caring for someone who does. So we can find out if there's a qualifier for them to work in the remote environment part of the plan. So we have a number of surveys out there right now. We've also have a student survey to find out how students are feeling about this plan. So we're really trying to understand what's happening in our community and look at that data to make the best decision moving forward along with public health. So we have a safe environment for our students. And you heard Dr. Glass say, an environment where we can return our students to 100% capacity if that is what our families choose. So I'm going to turn over to Dr. McDermott now. Thanks for your time, everyone.
Great, thank you, Kristopher. So for those of you who saw our plan on release on July 8th, you'll notice that there are 12 different sections that articulate a lot of the different departments within our organization. Within each of those sections and within each of our strategies for virus mitigation, they all align with these 4 different principles, which are place, space, people, and time. The place is we're trying to maximize fresh air airflow. We've improved our ventilation systems. Space, trying to maximize the amount of space between individuals when that's not possible, to have at least 6 feet, requiring the use of masks. People, you heard Kristopher mention maintaining cohorts, so keeping groups of students together to minimize the amount of different contacts that happen among students and staff. And then time, limiting the duration of interactions outside of those cohorts. So things such as transition plans between classes, one-way hallways, etc., to minimize the amount of interaction time that students have outside of the cohorts. What this actually looks like, these 4 principles in practice, these are just an example of some of the mitigation strategies of 6 feet of social distancing whenever possible. There will not be any use of large gatherings for communal spaces, no assemblies, no use of cafeterias for large lunch times as might have been during normal times pre-COVID. Student and staff face coverings are required, as I mentioned, when 6 feet of social distancing cannot be maintained. We have daily symptom screenings. So before entry into any of our buildings, students and staff will have their temperature taken. Mandatory hand washing, hygiene protocols, as well as cleaning protocols. And then, as we've mentioned several times, a lot of the guidelines that were provided for our schools around scheduling is maintaining cohorts of students together. Very briefly, what this looks like at each of the different levels. So elementary schools, it's the most similar to pre-COVID experience, where maintaining the same group of students together is fairly common at that age level. Where you see differences there is, again, they will not be using cafeterias for lunchtime. Lunch will be eaten inside of classrooms, and again, there will be mixed. There will be limited opportunities for students to interact outside of their class cohort. At the middle and high schools, we are limiting the number of classes that students can have in a single day to 4, so that the maximum number of cohorts that students would be able to interact with is 4 different cohorts. And you heard Kristopher mention the kind of typical classes of a freshman, that those would represent the 4 different cohorts that individual student would interact and in any given day. And then, similar to the elementary experience, meals would be eaten in the classroom or again outside of those large meeting spaces. So we do want to provide a lot of time for questions. So I'll end there and turn it back over to Dr. Glass.
Thank you, Tom. And Cami or Ryan, if you can enable screen sharing for me, we're now going to shift to Brad Rupert, and he's going to talk some about the budget challenges that we have had this year. One of the primary responsibilities and roles of the Board of Education is a fiduciary responsibility. It's passing a budget every year. And so the board really begins a budget process in November. As soon as we get the governor's initial budget proposal, we keep the board updated as the state legislature moves forward, because school funding in Colorado is heavily dependent on the decisions that happen in the legislature. And there are months of meetings and engagement that the board goes through before making a final decision around what the budget looks like. This has been an extraordinary year in that we went from thinking we were going to have more money, and we're having discussions and arguments in our community about how we would spend that additional money and what we might be able to do with it, to looking at a budget where we potentially were going tens of millions of dollars in reverse. And that happened at an abruptly fast pace. And Brad's now going to tell you some about where we are now, and I have a few slides to show. Let me turn things over to you, Brad, and you can start talking about that process, and I'll bring up the slides for you.
Thank you. So what I'd like to do is start with our normal budget process. As Jason just mentioned, it starts early in the year, November, December, when we start getting the governor's projections. That incorporates assumptions regarding growth, assumptions regarding inflation, and based on what we expect to be the revenues for the upcoming year, then we can start planning for how those revenues and the changes in revenues can be adjusted to. And it's a multi-month process, because as those numbers get more clear, more tight, we can start more detailed planning. And then typically what happens is the legislature will finalize its budgeting and school finance in late April or May, and then we do a final budget decision in May or June. What occurred this year, of course, is completely different. We were on that course until mid-February and March, and then everyone knows the wheels sort of fell off. All of the revenue anticipated for the upcoming year abruptly went away, and then the legislature had to take its COVID break. It delayed the entire budget process, and what occurred when they did come back was pretty severe. What you're looking at now are the revenue side assumptions. So in a balanced, in an income statement, you've got revenues on the top, and then you'll have expenditures below. The revenues for this upcoming year are that the state funding decreased $30 million. That is net of the money that goes to our charter schools, which represents roughly 10% of our district's population. And so our charter schools also are enduring a similarly proportioned decrease in revenue. The only positive piece of the revenue picture is that we have the 5A mill money from a year and a half ago that our voters provided us, and that had an inflationary adjustment. So we have a slight increase in the 5A money, but all these other factors are decreases. So specific ownership tax, the money that portion of the tax we pay for licensing our vehicles and purchasing new vehicles. Loss of interest. So our reserve funds are invested and earn interest, but interest rates are depressed, as you might know. And so we have a loss of interest. And then we are anticipating a loss of revenue from students because we will have somewhat fewer students. Jeffco has largely been flat or on a slight downward trend when it comes to our student populations. And so the last line item here is a reflection of that. So as you can see, we're anticipating a loss of revenue of $37 million net of some of the other things. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Jason, if you would, please.
Thanks. Yes, Brad, and if I might interject for just a second and add that this assumption around the student enrollment is really a roll of the dice right now. And it's because of the impacts of COVID. We see different districts around us and around the state presenting different models. Parents are making all sorts of decisions and thinking about homeschooling or enrolling in this district or that district and moving around kids based on what model they prefer. We know that a school choice market exists, and there's lots of portability options from one district to another or schools to another within Colorado. So we're trying to offer models, going back to Tom and Kristopher's conversation, that fit for what we heard from families in Jeffco, but it's a variable about where kids will actually end up next year, and it may have an impact on our funding depending on how many of them actually enroll in a Jeffco school.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. That's actually a really important point for Tom and Kristopher to cover, because we have a survey out there right now asking families what their intentions are. And there is a lot riding on that survey. We have to resolve transportation issues. We have to resolve class size issues, on and on. And so please, if you are a parent out there listening to this, go online, make sure that you complete that survey as quickly as possible, because the better information we have, the better decisions we can make. All right, so we're over to the expenditure assumptions. And this just sort of continues to get bad. As you know, we have mandated para increases each year to help stabilize the para fund. Para is the retirement account for state employees, and the large portion of the state employees is educators. And to keep that system stable, we have been required by the legislature to make contributions. So the increased contribution, that 0.5%, represents $2.6 million of mandatory increased expenditures. This is not discretionary to us, it is required. We have a little savings from retirement and turnover. This occurs every year, and this is when our higher paid experienced folks leave for retirement or other reasons, and they of course would be replaced by somewhat lower paid incoming staff. So that kind of saving occurs each year, and this is what our anticipated savings are for the 2021 year. We made some cuts and identified some ongoing savings during the 1920 school year, and those will be ongoing, so that's to the tune of $3 million. We expect a utility decrease simply because of the pricing of the utility market of about $1 million. Unfortunately, that's taken up by $1 million in increased insurance reserves. As you may recall, 3-4 years ago, we had a really terrible hailstorm. It resulted in very severe insurance claims and losses, and we've been struggling with insurance premium increases ever since. And so unfortunately, that $1 million is an increase in expenditures that is kept as low as possible, but it's a reality that we do have to cover our assets in the district. We are anticipating, we've been told to anticipate from the state, an increase in students at risk. And so we are anticipating an increase expenditure for that of about $5.5 million. We are also expecting one-time costs for personal protective equipment and the start of school. You can imagine that we are making a large investment in things like thermometers so we can take temperatures of the kids coming in the school. We're making an increased investment in things like cleaning equipment and masks and all the things that will be necessary to keep students and staff safe in the upcoming year in the context of COVID. So as you can see, the net of the expenditures, let's cover the last item. So we have COVID money, grant money from state and federal government to cover some one-time COVID expenditures. We used approximately $20 million of that money in the just past year, so the 1920 school year, on items that those grant funds could be spent on. And that resulted in a contribution to our reserves of about $20 million that we will be using in the upcoming year. So that 20 million from last year and then this 22 million that you see on the bottom of the screen combined will help us have a flat budget in this current budget year. Unfortunately, as we start looking for the budgeting process of next year, we don't expect to have this funding. So this will represent a 5% decrease in our funding next year that we need to plan for. And so I think that probably takes up my 10 minutes. Why don't you get to the last slide there, Jason? And this slide puts the two areas together. A decrease in our revenues, 37 million, a decrease in our expenditures of 16 million. That leaves the 21 million that is going to get covered by the COVID grant. That gets us to a flat budget year this year. We don't expect to be able to be in a flat situation for the upcoming budgeting process starting this coming December. All right, carry on, Jason.
Okay, thanks, Brad. And my hat is off to the Board of Education for the work that they've done this spring. It really is an extraordinary process to have to go through this budget year, especially. The budget is, again, one of the most important things that the Board of Education engages in every year, but this year has been really, really tough. The board always has to weigh in and make decisions on the very hardest things that school districts have to do, and that's certainly the case this year. Looking forward, even though we've got a budget in place, that doesn't necessarily mean that the budget work is over for this coming school year. We have a number of threats and potential shifts that may happen. A budget is a plan, and we made a heck of a lot of assumptions around what we thought revenues would do, what we thought expenditures would do, that were based on theories and ideas. And once we actually implement school, so in some ways we had to put together a budget without knowing the structure of what school looks like this fall, and that is still the case. As you've heard from Kristopher and Tom, things continue to shift. I do want to underscore what Brad said around the importance of, if you've got kids in school, it's important that you designate in that survey to the district, are you choosing an in-person option or a remote option? That helps us tremendously in trying to sort and sift the staff and reassign people, and so that we can provide the options that our parents want and configure the transportation system. But we are likely to have unexpected expenses this coming year. We've already seen the ballooning up of the protective equipment and the hand sanitation gels and all the cleaning products and all the changes to our ventilation system. All of those things are leading to greater expenses. And if we end up, we've made some assumptions on using this federal money to effectively offset some losses that we had from the states. We moved a lot of positions over into Federal CARES Act or COVID money to protect those roles. We're hearing from auditors from the state, from the federal government, that they keep increasing the red tape and regulations around that money, making it harder for us to spend it. So we may be in a position where they disqualify a lot of the things that we've done in the budget, and we end up having to send money back to Washington. That will infuriate me and should infuriate the board and all of you as well. But that is something that is happening and that we're concerned about, is that the regulatory agencies and bureaucrats and the auditors keep narrowing down how we can spend this money and adding more red tape to it. So that's a second concern. Another concern around the budget is the state had to make predictions around, and our legislators had to make predictions around what the budget was going to be this coming year as well. But we have seen in previous years, when you have budget shocks, sometimes the state has to come back together and do what's called a rescission. A rescission is where they pull money back out of school districts mid-year, and so that's possible as well. One of the advantages that Jeffco has through all of this is that the district has a stable cash reserve and a large cash reserve. Compared to a lot of other districts that don't have that, it's a tremendous advantage. It will allow us to absorb the budget shocks over the short term and potentially over multiple years. We are expecting to have multi-year effects because of this. So it may be 2 years, 3 years before we end up in a net positive situation at some point. But those are all threats or challenges that we'll have for this budget year and probably going forward as well. I want to end just with something that I think is also a major priority for the school district this coming year, and that is work around anti-racism and equity. So we've talked about COVID-19 challenges, we've talked about incredible and significant budget challenges, and now we have this issue of George Floyd's murder and all the civil unrest that came out as a result of that. Any one of these three challenges alone would be a massive lift for any school district. School districts all over the country having to deal with all three of these at once, which is daunting to say the least. If we look at some of the outcomes that we see in our school system here in Jeffco, and Jeffco is not atypical, right? We see these same effects around the country and in other districts here in Colorado. We know that we have achievement gaps. Black and brown kids perform at lower levels. And achieve at lower levels than other racial groups. If we look at our suspensions and expulsions, even accounting for mandatory suspensions and expulsions where we don't have any flexibility, we suspend and expel Black and brown kids at higher rates. They have greater interactions with the police. We also know that we identify more Black and brown kids for special education services, and we under-identify Black and brown kids for gifted and talented services. Folks, those are racial effects, and we have to confront that as a community. It's a difficult conversation, it's a challenging conversation, but it's past due time that we had discussions about that. So the work that we'll be doing going into this fall will include anti-racism and equity training for our staff. It will include a policy review of all of those elements that I've talked about, with the goal of working toward a long-range plan on what our Jeffco's response to this. I don't think that it should be a knee-jerk reaction. It shouldn't be just window dressing because of the current climate and situation that we're in. It really is the right thing to do. It's the right thing to talk about these issues and confront our policies and practices as a community and as a school district and ask, how can we do better? How can we be better? And how can we really meet that moral imperative that we have in schools of really serving every child and creating an opportunity and future for every child? So I know it's going to be hard work. I know that it's political, but it shouldn't be political. We all want every child to be successful, and we all want them to have great opportunities. So we should be open to those conversations. Cami, that ends the three big elements that we wanted to talk about with you. Let's turn things back over to you and see if we can answer some questions. And I think we've got a lot of time or a few minutes for that to try and get some of the urgent questions that are out there.
Perfect, thank you. And thank you to all of you for all of that information. Clearly really challenging times right now, and I appreciate all of you spending this morning with us to try to get through some of it. And to all of you that have been asking questions, thank you. Some really great comments and questions flying back and forth. I appreciate the resource sharing that's happening in the chat box. We're gonna get through as many of these as we can, so we'll call this fire round and we'll try to be brief, but then as I've committed to in the chat box, we will do our best to not only circulate this webinar after, but share the supplemental materials that are being shared in the chat box. So please look out for that after this. So I want to start by talking about outbreaks. And this is something that has come up in a couple different questions of what happens if there's a presumed case? What happens if there's a confirmed case? When do schools shut down? And what does that mean for a flip to online learning?
Sure, and I'll take these questions, and then Brad and Kristopher and Tom, if there's anything that you think that I missed, please jump in. We have seen some districts come out with sort of, they're trying to develop this matrix system of if this happens, then that. You can quickly wear yourself out with the hypotheticals on this. So the approach that we're taking is that we have a COVID incident commander. Her name is Julie Wilkin. She's the Director of Health Services for Jeffco Public Schools. And we have a great relationship with Jeffco Public Health and with Dr. Johnson. We're going to take these incidents, or when this happens, on a case-by-case basis. So you have to account for things like, was the student symptomatic or not? Were they at school when they become symptomatic? When did we find out that they had a confirmed case? Who all did they have contact with? And so you don't necessarily have to shut down an entire school because you have a confirmed case. It could be that a kid was asymptomatic and had no problems over a week. They were tested on the, or they got on a school bus, rode to school, and then we intercepted and found that student with a temperature check at school, and then we got them tested and identified. So we can contact trace back. We may only have to remove those students that were on the bus with that kid for that period of time. We also may have a staff member who contracts COVID who comes in contact with large groups of students. That would lead to a different scenario. We may have one elementary student that's in a class of 20. That would lead to a different scenario. So we really have to look at these situations as they present themselves and think through how do we best respond with the information and data that we have.
Perfect, thank you. So I'm going to move to talking about masks, and hopefully this is just a quick question. We were asked by Kim Tomasek if when kids are at their desk, are they wearing masks all day? What does this look like as a student in a classroom?
Yeah, well, this is another one of those incidents where the unsatisfactory answer is it depends. We do have a masking requirement for students. There are some exceptions to that when students are eating or if they have a health condition that doesn't allow for that. Our masking requirements that are in the plan fit with what the governor came out with yesterday. But the general rule of thumb is that where 6-foot social distancing cannot be maintained, masks are on. It's similar to how I think we're acting in businesses, or if you go to the airport where you have to be in close quarters with someone, the mask goes on. Where you can spread out, the mask can come off. And we have to build in times during the day when kids can remove the mask, to take breaks from it, especially where they can get outside and spread out. So masks are a requirement, but they have to be worn where 6-foot distancing can't be maintained.
Perfect. So Brogan from Red Rocks is my new favorite person because he asked a question about how you're handling guest speakers, thinking about job fairs, career exploration. How do we continue to get that authentic learning and all the work you've done over the years to build in those relationships with the business community? What does that look like as we move forward? Thank you, Brogan, for asking that question.
Yeah, we're not allowing outside visitors or even parents to come into schools. It's just a risk that we don't need to take. As much as we love the outside visitors and love those connections with the community and love having our parents and volunteers come in, kids have a much dramatically lower infection rate with this virus, and the adverse impacts on kids are much lower. Adults are a different story. So bringing more adults into our buildings or congregating adults is riskier than doing it with kids. So we're going to have to find some ways to be creative about that. We could do things outdoors. We can do things virtually. We can do things where everyone is wearing a mask and we spaced out. Sorry, my dog is angry about something in the backyard. But those are some of the creative solutions I think we'll have to come up with, because we want those relationships and conversation to continue to happen, but we're going to have to be smart about how we do it.
That makes sense. So I'm going to flip to a question from Evie Hudak, specifically about as you're getting these survey results back, and I'm sure there's a mix of people's sentiment right now of, yes, I plan to send my child back. No, we're going to be staying home. What does that look like? How do you guys as a district plan to accommodate your plans as you get those survey results back? If more people say they're going to do online learning than was expected, does that change everything?
Well, we had an early survey where we asked our parents this summer in May and June what their plans were. We had about 90% of our parents at that point say that they wanted their kids in an in-person experience. Now we're about 6 weeks after that initial survey has gone out. People know more about the virus. This is getting real because we've got weeks now before school restarts. And what we're seeing now is around 83% of our parents are requesting that in-person experience. So it's less than that initial data point. Around 83% is in line with what other districts are seeing as well. I expect it to drop a little bit more. We may end up with about 80%, which on the in-person learning side actually helps us, because that reduces, again, the number of students that we have in a classroom and moves some to that remote experience. The challenge is going to be lining up the staff requests with the student requests. So we also have a simultaneous survey out where our staff are requesting different work assignments. We're going to try and honor as many of those as we possibly can, prioritizing staff members who have an underlying health condition or someone in their family has an underlying health condition.
Perfect, thank you. And I know we have a lot of questions coming in, and I'm trying to navigate as many as possible. So I'll just reaffirm this commitment that if we don't get to your question, maybe all of us can work together to get out an FAQ after to the attendees so we can make sure we answer everything. So I'm going to try, and I know this is not a short answer, but two more that I'm going to hit you with. The first is, with the online learning platform, we've been asked, is that going to be more robust than it was in the spring, or is it going to look the same as what parents have had exposure to?
Well, I think it will look similar, but I do think that we have learned some lessons from this past spring. Again, we had to transition to remote learning very quickly, and I'm proud of the way that we did that, but we shouldn't whitewash it. There were challenges with that for sure. So we will continue to have supports and trainings and examples in place for our teachers that are going to be teaching in a remote environment. They'll be specialized in that area, so we won't have teachers going back and forth trying to do both unless we have an outbreak of some kind, have to transition to that model again. So I think you'll see an improved remote learning experience, but the fundamentals of it, where a kid is working on their device through Zoom or Google Hangouts, or and doing projects on their own, doing projects remotely or virtually with other kids, the fundamentals of it are going to be the same. There definitely are limitations to the technology, but I think that you'll see the benefit of learning in that experience that we had this past spring, plus focused trainings on it this fall.
Perfect, thank you. And then the last one that I'll just ask for a quick little snippet from you on is, what do you need from all of us, from your business and community leaders? How do we help the district navigate all of these? These are big challenges that you're walking into the school year with. How do we help?
Yeah, the greatest concern, what's keeping me up at night, is if we see an exponential growth in community transmissions, which we're seeing honestly in other states around the country. We haven't seen that explode here in Colorado the way we've seen it in Alabama or in Florida, but that's what I would say. Don't be a vector for this virus, because if this thing takes off in the community, there is no way that we're going to reopen schools when we have high levels of infection rates in the community, because it's sort of a terrible analogy, but it is Russian roulette when you let somebody in the building. And so we've got to keep our community numbers as low as we possibly can, and that helps us mitigate and reduce the risk in schools. The international systems that we have studied and looked at, that we borrowed their plans for how to safely reopen, those international systems worked really hard to suppress community transmission. We've got to do that in Colorado. We've got to do that in the United States.
Thank you. I want to thank all of our panelists, and I do want to congratulate you, Dr. Glass, on your new role in Kentucky. We're very sad to lose you, but I appreciate the amazing opportunity to be close to family, and Kentucky is crushing it on all things education, so I know you'll have a great experience there. So thank you for your leadership in the district over these years.
Thank you,
Yes, thank you. I'm going to now move us quickly to Angela Lever. We're going to do our very best to wrap up right at 9. Angela is a fairly new executive director for the Jeffco Schools Foundation, and I've really enjoyed getting to know her, and they've got some exciting things to share with you this morning. Thank you, Angela.
Thank you, Cami. Can you hear me okay?
You sound great. Thank you.
Oh, great. Wonderful. Thank you. And I really appreciate the presentation from our district partners and all of the amazing work that is going into this very complex situation. So as the executive director of the Jeffco Schools Foundation, we have been a partner to Jeffco Public Schools for about 40 years. We're an independent 501c3, and we are also a very proud member of the Arvada Chamber. So I'm very excited to be here, and just very briefly wanted to share a couple of things. I think we just heard some wonderful strategy for what the district is doing and planning and trying in this very unprecedented time. But I also wanted to shout out the partnership that we've had with the district to actually support our schools and families through COVID-19, those actually most immediately impacted and adversely impacted our most vulnerable families. So we were able to, through a request from our district, start a COVID-19 fund. And we had so many community members that immediately signed up and supported us to be able to directly support our students and schools. And we could not have done that without our school partners. Over the school year, we were able to provide, in terms of direct emergency support, direct support to about 3,500 students across 55 schools of our 155 schools. And we built direct partnerships with about 80 of those schools. Then as we moved toward the summer, through the leadership of Dr. Glass and Food and Nutrition Services, we realized that we were going to have a significant need in terms of providing resources and food to our students and families who had seen an increasing need for those emergency type resources. So we have seen, as of 2 weeks ago, I think, Dr. Glass, 97,000 students having individual meals served to them per the 11 district sites. At the same time, we brought together our community partners through the leadership of the Action Center. And we're seeing our community partners come to those school sites and give fresh produce, meat, dairy, and families are really able to access that. The Jeffco Schools Foundation has been able to give out nearly $40,000 so far this summer in King Super gift cards. So that emergency response need is what we were able to do in partnership with our district because of our community, because of you. We want to continue to support in those ways. I think the other big message that I would share is that thanks to a partnership with Comcast and Lockheed Martin and support from the Education Nonprofit Corporation, we are able to support up to 300 low-income families to access in-home internet. We still have significant numbers that we are available to actually support those families to sign up. We believe this directly supports the district's remote learning model and the Restart Plan in ways, and we're closely partnering with the IT team on this. So if you know families and if you can get the word out there, we absolutely still have resources, and we want to get folks signed up before the 3rd week of August, before school starts. So jeffcoschoolsfoundation.org, or you can contact me and we can provide additional information. But just again, wanted to say, as a parent, as an executive director of the Jeffco Schools Foundation, really appreciate the thoughtfulness that has gone into this planning, and just hopeful and wanting for us all to partner together and continue to move forward. So thank you, Cami, for having me, and thank you, Dr. Glass and Brad and others. Really appreciate your leadership.
Thank you, Angela. So I know we're rounding out our time together. We do have Dr. Haney, and I have a few announcements here at the end. So if you're able to hang on with us, we really appreciate it. Dr. Haney, are you ready to go with a quick Red Rocks update?
I am certainly ready, and I know we have very few minutes, so I'll just try to hit the highlights. I could have said when Jason was talking, ditto, 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 because we have similar issues and similar challenges. So I guess the one thing I want to say is we are open, but open has a different connotation. We are not going to be doing for fall any truly just solely face-to-face programming. Our options are a little bit different than the district. We're looking at remote. We use the same language, but sometimes it means a little bit different. So remote, which also means that students will be seeing both their instructors in a synchronous time and will be coming, but will not be coming on campus at all. We will have strictly online, which means students will be able to sign in and watch their instructor, but it will be at their leisure. And then we'll have a hybrid. And that's primarily in our health fields and our lab courses, where students are required to have an opportunity to be in a laboratory. So those are the three models that we're using. Again, we have many bosses. We have the governor, we have the Department of Health, I have my own boss, and so it's a daily opportunity to change. But I have to tell you that I'm really proud of my staff and my faculty, because they had basically a week to turn around, as the school district had, little bit different for us. 60% of our faculty are part-time. So many of them had never had the opportunity to teach online. So we threw in all sorts of training opportunities so that they could get that expertise basically overnight. We haven't as much of an issue in terms of budget. The state cut us 58% in terms of higher education. Thank goodness for the CARES money, the stimulus money that came in, that allowed us to basically have a flat budget for this year. But next year, who knows? So if I could give you a message to send out there, please tell students we're open. Please tell students, you know, don't stop your education. Don't take a gap year. Come on in. We'll do our best to make a difference for you. So I know we're done, but I'd be glad to hang on for any other opportunities to answer questions. So thanks, Cammie.
Thank you, Dr. Haney. I appreciate it. And I think the sentiment we can all take away from today is we're building the plane and flying it at the same time. And so the degree of grace that we all need to offer each other, I think is important. And I hope that that is something that we all can continue to do. As we round out our presentation today, I give a couple quick updates for all of you on things happening here at the Arvada Chamber. As you've heard us say in previous settings, we are working hard to make sure we're supporting your business during this time. We did reopen the second round of the Arvada Small Business Mini Grant. So that is for any business located within Arvada. You can get a grant for operations, technology, or compliance. There is more detail on our website about that. We are still encouraging you to take the Safe and Open Pledge. We are communicating those widely that your business is safe and you're doing everything that you can to keep your customers and your employees safe. And then thanks to a partnership with the City of Arvada, we are able to offer free PPE supplies to all Arvada businesses. And there is a form again on our website to help you with that information. As we kind of move into the next things the Chamber is working on, we have 2 leadership programs that are launching this fall, one around Leadership Boot Camp. We've changed the model where historically it was a 9-month program. Now it's once a week, 90 minutes for 3 months. It's really, truly a boot camp. And we will make sure that, I apologize, there's an Amber Alert coming through right now, but we'll make sure that we are supporting those conversations of professional growth. We've added a new resiliency boot camp for 2020. This is going to be focused on building your business and rebuilding it through this pandemic and preparing for what may come ahead. So that's going to be a really nice program. And I will note that we have a ton of scholarships for both of these and would encourage anyone who's interested to apply. I promise it will be worth your time. Last slide here from me is our work luncheon coming up on July 29th. Please join us for that. It's a free event this year. We have some amazing people that we're recognizing. We will be sending out a survey for Arvada Works. Obviously, work-based learning is changing a little bit, but we want to continue to offer opportunities for our businesses to connect with students and with our education system. We're finding out what that looks like, virtual mock interviews, things for you to still engage. And so please take a moment to complete that. And then last, but certainly not least, we have 3 spots open on our board this year. And so I want to encourage you to apply for that. If you're interested in learning more, please let me know. Thank you. I know that was a lot of information very fast, clearly a ton going on right now, but we are incredibly grateful to all of you for joining us. Again, thank you to our sponsors for making these events possible. We will see you next month as we gear up for candidate forums for the next few months. Thank you, everybody. I hope you have a fantastic day.